Hey, and welcome to the People Power Lunch Hour Show. I'm your host, Vanessa Maria Graber. On today's show, we're going to be talking about gerrymandering, redistrict reform, and elections. Today in the studio, I'm joined by my two guests, Rabbi and Executive Director of the March on Harrisburg, Michael Pollack, and the co-chair of Fair Districts PA, co-founder, co-chair, Carol Kuniholm of Fair Districts PA. We're going to talk about some exciting developments that have happened in the last 2 years due to all the organizing work and grassroots campaigns that have been happening throughout the state. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us.
So, last time you were here was a couple years ago. Michael, you've been on several times, and we're happy to report that this time since you've returned, there's been a lot of progress made on this front. For people who aren't familiar with gerrymandering or redistricting, could you give them a brief overview about how redistricting reform would impact their ability to elect officials that are more representative from where they live?
Absolutely. So the core problem we have right now is that we have a government that is disconnected from the public. We have politicians who don't actually listen to the public, who aren't responsive to the public because they don't need to be, because they're able to pick their own voters through something called gerrymandering. And gerrymandering is when politicians in the smoky back rooms of Harrisburg get together and draw district lines that benefit them and that put their interests first. And so what they do is they create districts where they're going to certainly win, where they can't lose, where they can knock out opponents, where they can skew the electorate to favor them. And so we've been taking this on for, you've been at it since 2015, I think. We've been at it since 2016. And we're making progress. We have a hearing coming up on September 18th in Harrisburg at 9 a.m. And we're hopeful that all the pressure that's been built over the last few years and all of the meetings and all of the marches and all of the protests and just all of the everything, all of the education has really led us to this point where we're hopeful that we're going to get some wins, that we're going to get some things through.
So I just want to back that up a sec, because that is really exciting, and it's not a problem that's unique to Pennsylvania. It's happening in other states. We probably have heard of the issue happening in North Carolina and the subsequent lawsuits happening for that. But for folks who are unfamiliar with gerrymandering or redistricting reform, we're going to give you some information that we found from this really great website, Fair Districts PA. So it's full of information. And if you want to go in depth and read more, that website is a wealth of information. So current PA law puts state legislators in charge of redistricting, the process of redrawing voting districts, which happens every 10 years to reflect population changes. So the next one is during the 2020 census. So
it'll take place after. So 2020 census and then 2021. All the maps get redrawn. Yep.
Which is another important issue, which we'll get into as well, the census.
That's right.
So they work behind the scenes with no oversight or standards for fairness. They use mapping technology and big data to profile voters and use that information to pick exactly who they want in and out of a voting district. And then they can draw whatever boundaries will maximize their influence, minimize their accountability, and keep their seats in office secure. The result is gerrymandering, the practice of manipulating voting districts to benefit parties, not people. Why is gerrymandering bad?
Well, let me say, so one win that we do need to talk about is the state lawsuit. But gerrymandering basically allows legislators to decide, the people who control the process, and the congressional and state legislative are done differently. But if one party can control the process, they can just draw themselves extra, they can make it so that they win even if they don't have a majority of voters. And they can also X off people that don't do what they're told. So the leadership can really grab power. They can get rid of people who don't vote the way they're told. They can draw very special, carefully finagled districts for their colleagues or their cronies. And they can really determine the outcome before the election takes place. So in Pennsylvania, the last time around, 2011, the Republicans grabbed control of the mapping process, and they did a really phenomenal job of drawing extremely gerrymandered districts. So they drew our congressional districts so that there would be 13 R districts and 5 D districts in every election, no matter how many folks showed up, no matter how the actual vote went. So in some years, the R's got a slight advantage in votes. 13-5. And the D's got a slight advantage in votes, 13-5. So that actually went to a lawsuit because according to the various tests of gerrymandering, Pennsylvania's were the worst in the country from 2011 through 2017 when that lawsuit was filed. The great news, and one of the wins that we really should celebrate, because this happened since the last time we were here, the great news is that the state Supreme Court said, yeah, that map is unconstitutional. We need a new map. That new map was drawn, and because of the new map, there were people who had been in their specially finagled districts who decided, ooh, I would actually have to run and I'd have to talk to constituents, and I'm not going to do that. So those folks resigned wonderfully. And then there were some new folks who said, hey, there's actually going to be competitive elections. I'm going to run. So we had 4 women in Pennsylvania win. The first time we've ever had more than 2. First time we've had women in Congress since 2012. And so it changed our delegation to D.C., and it went from 13-5 to 9-9, which is what it ought to be. So that really shows that maps matter a lot when it comes to our elections.
And the result of the gerrymandered districts is that you have representatives that are elected that are maybe not reflective of the population they're supposed to be serving. The long-term effect of that is that good laws may not ever make it out of committee. Bad laws might get, sent to the governor's desk, and all sorts of things are cut out of the budget. And we've seen that happen already in recent years.
Yeah, so there's a state legislative aspect to this. A lot of people focus on Congress when they talk about gerrymandering, and they look at congressional districts that are gerrymandered. Pennsylvania's state house and Senate districts are also extremely gerrymandered, and in fact, we think they're the worst in the country. Again, if you look at the distance between the votes cast and the seats won. And what that does is it puts all the power in the hands of the leaders who are drawing the maps, and they get to set the agenda on pretty much everything. And they set it to benefit the special interests that fund them and their campaigns and their gifts. And the average legislator has almost no say, really.
I mean, it's the core issue is who are the politicians responsible for and who are they responsive to? And when party leaders are able to go into back rooms and literally draw representatives out of their districts and draw them into new districts, put them into a previously uncompetitive race and make them actually compete and fund their opponents in all of this, then our politicians are responsible to the party leaders, not to the people. And that's just the general situation we find ourselves in, whether we're talking voter suppression or money in politics or redistricting or ethics reform. Any of these democracy issues are all about separating our politicians from special interests, party bosses, and big money, and connecting our politicians with we the people.
So I want to let folks know about your organization again if they haven't heard of it, because it's fairly new, but you all have hit the ground running and you've accomplished so much since your inception. And that's the March on Harrisburg, and their mission is to make corruption illegal and take our democracy to where it's never been.
You make it sound so easy.
They work to end corruption and move Pennsylvania from the 5th most corrupt state in the USA into one of the least corrupt by passing a wave of democracy bills to end excessive money in politics and gerrymandering and secure and expand the right to vote. Can you talk a little bit more about all those connections, right? Because even though people might work on these issues individually, they're all interrelated.
Absolutely, absolutely. We have to pass maybe 25 bills to get us into the top 5 in the democracy rankings nationwide. And all of these bills are very much connected, right? And they're all designed to make voting more accessible, more secure, and easier, so that instead of things like having to change our register, or having to register 3 months before the election, why not just be able to register the day of the election? Instead of only being able to vote on one Tuesday in early November, why not be able to vote for the 3 weeks before? Why not have early voting? Instead of independents being locked out of primary elections, why not have open primaries? There's just so many things that we need to do, and we really need to be able to imagine a democracy where we, the people, are the ones who hold our politicians to account. And that looks like ending voter suppression. It also looks like things like public campaign financing. So having it so that politicians don't have to go and beg rich people in Pebble Beach or New York City for money every few months, that instead they can knock on doors and raise money from their constituents, from their voters. It means things like a gift ban so that lobbyists can't take our politicians out and just bribe them, just wine and dine them, take them to the Super Bowl, take them to the Kentucky Derby. It means things like campaign finance reform so that Comcast we actually do have corporate bans, but individuals within Comcast can just give as much. I'm sorry, we don't have corporate bans. No, Comcast can give as much as they want. The individuals can't. It's all a mess.
All
and
this
it's all designed
corruption
to
gets
confuse
very
you.
confusing, right?
Exactly.
Confusing.
And the goal of all of these things is, again, to disconnect government from special interests and connect it with us, because the private interests that special interests represent are not necessarily public interests, and usually they're opposed to public interests. Right? Comcast doesn't spend so much money lobbying because they have the public's interest at heart. They don't. They spend so much lobbying so they can continue to not pay taxes, so that they can continue to function as a monopoly, so that they can continue to thwart any competition, any innovation that's coming up. So these issues are just all so connected. Things like natural gas, right? The natural gas industry, it thrives off of first keeping us divided through gerrymandering so that we don't really get real representation, suppressing the vote so that real elections can't quite happen, and then buying the politicians once they're voted in through these imprecise and terrible electoral things. And so they spend $5 to $9 million a year lobbying and in unlimited gifts. They spend about that in campaign contributions too. They have 203 registered lobbyists. That's one for every state representative we have. And because of all of this, Pennsylvania is responsible for 1% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. We have plants in South Philly that are catching fire. We have a new cracker plant out in Beaver County out in western Pennsylvania that's just spewing more and more plastic crap into the oceans. Right, so all of these issues that affect our day-to-day life, the environment, healthcare, wages, how awful Comcast is. I'm sorry, I've been getting into a fight with Comcast the last few weeks, so I'm really going after them today. But all of these issues come back to the fact that we do not have a democracy, that our elections are not accurate, and that once elected, our elected officials are not accountable to the people.
Thanks for drawing those examples, because I think the natural gas industry is a really good example of all the different levels in which they affect our democracy. Carol, Fair Districts PA is also a fairly new organization founded in 2016, and they're officially an arm of the League of Women of Voters of Pennsylvania, and you're on the board of that.
No more. I'm no longer on the board.
Former board member. Ex officio.
I had to pry myself off because my Fair Districts PA work got to be pretty exhausting. So
we'll talk about why you all started this organization and what it's been happening since you started it 3 years ago.
Yeah, I actually was a youth pastor in Paoli, and our church had a partnership in Kensington. And I spent a week every summer in Kensington with the kids from my church and the kids from that church, doing outreach and getting to know those kids really well. And then they actually were kind of part of our youth group. When we did retreats or trips, we would bring the kids from both churches on those trips. And I just became really perplexed and alarmed at the inequity in school funding, because I had kids who had indoor pools, and when they did school trips, they went to Europe. And I went to watch their musicals, and they had beautiful stage and beautiful sets, and they all of them had those nice little lapel mics that I just thought, wow, that's pretty extravagant. And then the kids in Philly didn't have an auditorium in their school, didn't have a library in their school, didn't have a full-time nurse, didn't have a full-time librarian, didn't have playgrounds. I heard on the radio just yesterday that one of the Philly schools opened a new playground, and 2/3 of our Philly schools don't have playgrounds, and none of our Philly elementary schools have libraries. The kids in the Kensington High School library just last year, the seniors, as their school gift to their school, put in a library done by themselves. Imagine a high school library created by high school seniors. It just broke my heart and made me pretty angry. And as I like to understand things, and I was trying to understand how is it possible that we have elementary schools that don't have libraries? To me, that is beyond understanding. And I started trying to understand our school funding model and realized we have the most inequitable school funding model in the country, twice as inequitable as the next most inequitable state, which is Vermont. Very minimal state contribution to school funding, which is why we have such high property tax. So the state does not fund schools adequately, and so it falls to the property owners in communities. And in communities where they can ramp up the property tax, they fund their schools well, and in places where they can't, those kids go without. And the more I tried to understand, the more every road I looked at pointed back towards Harrisburg. Public defenders, I don't know if you know, but Pennsylvania is the only state that doesn't have a state contribution to public defenders. It really depends what county you're arrested in, whether you get constitutionally required public defenders or not. That's a state legislative decision. Another one, I have lots of things I just keep being appalled. Another one I'm appalled by is lead. So we have 18 cities in Pennsylvania with worse lead levels than Flint, Michigan. In Pennsylvania, it's in the air. It's not in the water, and you cannot buy your children bottled air. So we have 18 cities with high lead levels, and I had an intern this past year do a little research on bills introduced in our state legislature to address this. Mandatory testing, mandatory remediation in places where children live or in places where children study or play or daycare centers. There have been over 25 bills introduced across the last 2 decades. None ever get a hearing in committee. They've passed lead awareness days, and there was a bill passed to do some study, but there's been nothing passed over 2 decades to address the fact that we have children across the state. This isn't just a Philly issue. This is across the state, 18 cities across the state, and anywhere we have older housing or older schools. Those kids are getting lead poisoning. Those kids are going to be, there's no cure. There's no cure, and every dollar spent on addressing that is a huge societal savings across the kid's life. So those kinds of things made me think something is really, really broken, something's really wrong. And I got involved in the League of Women Voters. I ended up on the state board. I started looking at our elections and saying, why do they not listen to voters? Or why are these bills introduced? And less than 7% of bills introduced in Harrisburg ever get passed. How is that possible? I mean, this is a full-time legislature. They are the among the least bills passed, among the lowest percentage of bills passed in the country. And how is that possible? And when I talked to people trying to understand, people said, oh, well, gerrymandering. And I said, I don't even know what that word means. So 4 years ago, I sat down and said, I'm going to figure out what that word means. And when I started to understand, I said, this is kind of foundational to our democracy. I started asking people, what would be a solution? And they said an independent citizens commission, and that it will never happen in Pennsylvania, which I feel like, how can you say that the most foundational change we could have will never happen? And people in Pennsylvania and across the country, electoral reform folks said, you don't have initiative and referendum, your leaders will never give up power, and people will never pay attention. So I said, I'm a youth pastor, or was a youth pastor. I was able to make middle school boys pay attention to conversations about the Trinity. So I could probably get adults to think about gerrymandering, and I set out to do that, and I have done that. So we've had over 750 public meetings now across the state in the last 3 years. We've had over 28,000 people attend those. We've had over 60,000 people sign petitions to end gerrymandering. We have a volunteer list that goes out every other Friday to over 5,500 people who are actively working on this. So we have encouraged people to pay attention to this. Can we get leadership to give up power? We're still trying to figure that out, but we are working really hard to see some foundational change in the way our state operates.
That's the major question of how do you get a corrupt legislature to outlaw their own corruption? You know, whether it's gerrymandering or gift ban or any of these issues, how do you do that? And so there's really 2 methods to go for. One sounds really good to say publicly, and the other one I'm a bit ashamed of saying, but it is what it is. I mean, one way is that you make them see the public good. You make them see that this is actually beneficial to Pennsylvania, that this is good for their children and their grandchildren, and that this will unlock the gridlock, allow our legislature to actually function, allow it to actually serve the people, and we're all going to rise together if that were to actually happen. We would all be better off, including Speaker Turzai and Majority Leader Cutler and all of the leadership. And then the other way is to make them see the private gain that they would get if they actually passed reform. And that's the harder way to go, but that's the way that actually gets them to do things. They need to be able to look in the mirror and say, I want to keep going to work. I don't want to stay home in next year. I don't want to lose my election. And so there's a lot of pressure that you have to put on them. And then they pop out, and then they say the right thing, and then maybe they'll do the right thing, and then after the fact they claim credit for doing the right thing the whole time, and we stand there and go, yeah, well done, guy, well done. good job.
I would say the third way is people power, which you all have been really good at harnessing. And just reading the news today, seeing the outcome of the protests in Hong Kong and how They finally withdrew this bill that was very controversial. And so here in Pennsylvania, we have the ability to do the same. Just putting it out there. But we're going to talk about solutions when we come back. If you're just tuning in, you're watching the People Power Lunch Hour show here on PhillyCAM TV and radio. I'm your host, Vanessa Maria Graber, and we'll be right back. Hello, welcome back to the People Power Lunch Hour show. I'm your host, Vanessa Maria Graber, and on today's show, we're talking about redistrict reform, elections, and democracy. I have two guests in the studio. I have Executive Director of the March on Harrisburg, Rabbi Michael Pollack, and also the co-founder and chair of Fair Districts PA, Carol Kuniholm. Welcome back. So in the first segment, we defined gerrymandering again and its negative effects and how that impacts our democracy. And now I'd like to focus on people power and using people power to gain the solution, right, to this problem. Obviously, there's many different ways you can address redistricting. One of the proposals on the table is to perhaps have an independent commission. And so the question is, who should draw the maps? If the legislators can't be trusted by drawing them fairly, then who should draw them, and how do we select those people? What thoughts do you have on those two issues?
Well, I would say the legislators should not be the ones drawing the maps. I think that we're the only democracy that allows that. It gives us a really low rating in the Electoral Integrity Project when they look at that particular aspect of our democracy. Other countries just say, why in the world would you let legislators draw their own maps? It's like letting the one team decide one of their players is the referee for a game, or letting somebody do their own job review, or letting a kid grade their own test. I mean, it's not good practice. It's a conflict of interest. And in fact, the Governor's Reform Commission came out with a report last week that showed overwhelmingly Pennsylvanians believe legislators should not be drawing their own maps. And this is across political parties, across demographics, geographic regions. Pennsylvanians do not believe legislators should be drawing their maps, and they believe that an independent citizens commission is the best way to do it, to have people who are not vested in it, whose jobs don't depend on it, whose income doesn't depend on it, to have independent citizens. And that doesn't mean they're all independent voters. It means you set up a commission that balances interests. You can have Republicans and Democrats and independent third-party folks, but set up in a way that the vote has to reflect a consensus, that people have to collaborate, have to think carefully together about how do we draw maps that reflect communities rather than our hand-drawn for specific legislators.
I mean, the simple answer is just not what we have now. I mean, what we have now is just so it flies in the face of common sense to let legislators draw their own lines. The simple answer is just we the people draw the lines, people who don't have a conflict of interest. It's amazing how many of these democracy bills just don't pass the common sense test at all. Like with gifts. Yes, you can bribe your legislator with Super Bowl tickets. That's just not okay. We all know that that's not okay on the surface. That Comcast can cut whatever check it wants. That's not okay. We all know that's not okay on the surface. Gerrymandering, that legislators draw their lines. That's just not okay.
I wonder if you have ideas on how the people on the independent commission would get selected or chosen, because it seems like legislators could still try to get their own people or representatives on that commission, and then we would sort of be right back in the same boat.
That's every solution to this problem needs to be approached through the lens of, if I'm trying to game the system, how do I do it? And if I can do it, it's not a good solution. We need to go back to the drawing board and try something else. So having legislators directly appoint the commissioners, not a good idea. Not a good idea, because even if, let's say, Speaker Turzai can't be on the commission, well, his neighbor can, or his best friend can, or a former political operative can. So it's really about making sure that the people who are on the commission do not have a conflict of interest, and that you cannot game this commission. And so we've been fighting at this for a while, and every time we fight, they'll come back to us with a compromise where they can still game the system. We've seen a lot of plans like that where they're gameable, and our goal is just to say no to those and keep fighting for what actually works, what we can do.
So we have two bills that we're supporting right now, House Bill 22 and 23. There's two because of the timing issue. One is a constitutional amendment to change the way the state legislative districts are drawn. The other addresses the election code to change the way congressional districts are drawn. But those two bills propose an independent commission that's people would self-nominate. They could apply, and then those who are past legislators, current legislators, lobbyists, or staffers would not be allowed to be eligible. And then there would be pools created and then a random selection process. Now, there's been pushback on the random selection process. So in the past session, Senator Mike Fulmer amended the bill that we were supporting then, Senate Bill 22, so that legislators are choosing from the pools. So you still have some level of distance. You've got pools, but then the legislators are choosing from them. The Governor's Commission report that came out last week had a novel idea that we had not seen, which is that the legislative leaders are choosing from their party, but also from the opposing party. So they would be choosing, two Republicans and two Democrats. It's an interesting idea. Does that keep it from being gamed? Michael and I are still discussing that, as are many folks around the state. I've been wondering, could you have this is the first time I've ever mentioned this, except to Michael earlier today, but what if you had advocate groups and legislators and retired judges and college presidents propose a pool of candidates for each party and a pool of independent and third party. So you could put together pools of, diverse pools from around the state, nominated by people who are thinking about this issue, and then perhaps allow a certain number of strikes from those different groups so that they could say, no, this is Mike Turzai's next door neighbor, and he got his local college professor to nominate him. That's not okay. But go through and do some public testing out of who those pools are, and get those pools to a place where people said, yeah, any of these 120 folks in each pool I would be fine with, and then the legislative leaders could choose, as the Governor's Commission proposed, they could choose two from their party, two from the other party, and then an independent. So one of the ways that this is, one of the things to think about is how do you put together a commission, who chooses the commission, how is it selected, but then you also have to think about things like what kind of vote do they have. So if you have it set up so that the people on the side of both major parties can control the vote, you've shut out the independent voice. So ideally you'll have somebody from each block that would have to approve a map. That would be one way. Then there's also transparency requirements, which are hugely important, that everything is in the public eye, that the public has input, that nobody's using partisan data. Those things are all important. And then how do you approve the final map? Are there ways to game that, or who does it go to? There was a lot of pushback on, is it if the commission can't agree, who gets to decide? Does it go back to the legislators? Well, that's a disaster. Does it go to a court-appointed special master? There are people who feel like, well, that's pretty partisan too. The bills that we're supporting right now have a new idea that hasn't been tested out in states, but we think it's a really good idea, which is the fail-safe in this event of an impasse is an elimination vote. So the commissioners have to, they can't agree on a map. They get to propose their favorite map. They get to explain why it's their favorite. There's a 10-day public view where the public could say, this map is obviously gerrymandered. This one treats our region really well. We've tested it out. We think these are the best. Everybody could have their say. And then there'd be a televised public vote among the commissioners, elimination vote, as they winnow it down to the final the final map. We think it keeps it within the commission. It invites the public even further into the process. We think most commissions would probably not want to do that, and they'd rather decide before they get there. But in the case that they cannot decide, it would keep it within the commission in a really public way. And that's really important. What happens at the beginning is important, what happens through the middle, and what happens at the end. Those are all important pieces of this legislation.
And there's so many ways to do this right? And there's just only a few ways to do this wrong. And so the question is always, can this be gamed by the legislature? And I want us to be really clear about what the motivations of legislative leadership are at this point and kind of what they're angling toward. On the Democratic side, they don't want anything to happen. They don't want reform to happen because in 2021, 2022, they get to draw the maps. If all things stay the same, they control the state Supreme Court. They're looking forward to drawing the maps because that's the tie-breaking vote, the state Supreme Court. On the Republican side, we see a power grab taking place here, where they're trying to change from the current system to something where the legislature holds all the power, so that they can then appoint their own people onto the commission, keep the maps for another 10 years in Republican hands. So we see there's this stall tactic on the Democratic side and this power grab tactic on the Republican side, and we're just trying to chart some sort of middle course where it's the people that are represented and not party leadership on either side, but actually the people who get to decide what are our district lines, who do we get to vote for, how do our elections come out.
Yes, and Carol mentioned the Pennsylvania Redistricting Reform Commission report. That is a report to the governor on this very issue. And they ask the question, and they asked people from Pennsylvania who should draw the maps, and overwhelmingly people said, as much as possible, citizens, not politicians, should hold the pen that draws and revises election maps. They asked what criteria should be used, and then the criteria and values by which the maps are drawn should be clear, consistent, and accountable, which I think is the most important part. And they also want the process to be straightforward, open, and transparent. And I think transparency is super important, especially when you're engaging in a new process. And that's all the things that you all mentioned as well. And so this report is available online if you want to read it. There's a lot of really good information here. And they pull a lot of anecdotes from people from all around the state that talk about how this affects them. And so I think if people want to read more, again, this is another really great resource. Is there anything else from the report that you gleaned that people should know about?
I think it was just amazing how overwhelming the consensus was that the system we have now does not work. And it doesn't work because people feel shut out of the process. I've had people call me. People get our 1-800 number off of our website, and they will call that number, and sometimes it patches through to me, and I'll answer it. And one day there was a man who said, I'm a Republican from, I think it was Westmoreland County. He said, I am so angry at these maps, and I have to drive, and he started describing the geography of where he lived and the fact that to get from his house to his House representative's office, he had to go around this mountain through several other districts to get, and it took him 45 minutes, just drive. He was like, this is absolute nonsense. And I hear that. I've spoken now, I think, in more than half the Pennsylvania counties, and everywhere I go, doesn't matter what party it is, doesn't matter where I am, people say, yeah, I don't, just look at the maps and you can see how ridiculous it is. It's hard to feel connected and you feel shut out. But I think it's also really important that people realize, as Michael and I both have talked, that the reforms that we want, if the leadership are the ones setting the agenda, we can't get the things that we think need to happen done. So there are many legislators who go to Harrisburg with really good ideas. There are good things that they want to do. They want to represent their communities. I mean, most people don't wake up and say, I'm going to run for office because then I can just sit around and do nothing. And it's not a particularly satisfying job if you really can't get anything done. Most people who run actually have ideas of things they'd like to accomplish. And what they discover when they get there is it's not going to happen. The leaders decide who the committee chairs are. The committee chairs shut down any possible bill unless they agree to it. Very little gets done, and the people who draw the maps, set the agenda, collect the money, draw the maps, set the agenda, collect the money. It's a very tight little knot of dysfunction until the public attention, and this comes back to people power, unless people rise up in a very very consistent and determined and informed way to say this is not working for us and we have to change it. Unless that happens, it's really not going to change. It's people knowing who their legislators are, talking to their legislators, saying, what are you doing to support this change? And so I'm going to make a little pitch here. This doesn't happen unless people invest in democracy itself, unless people say, okay, I care, whatever it is that you care about, and it could be shale gas, it could be the fact that your kid has asthma because the air is terrible, it could be the fact that your kid's school doesn't have a library. I mean, we've all got our own. I've got my list. You've got your list. Is it gun violence, gun safety? Is it why are we the only state that doesn't have a shale tax? Is it why don't we privatize liquor because we're the only state I know that still is playing this weird little game? What is the issue that you care about? And then look at bills that have been introduced in Harrisburg and the fact that they don't even get a vote. I would be fine if those things came for a vote and the things I care about got voted down. I'm okay with that. The fact that they don't even move in committee and don't ever come to a vote, I'm not fine. That is not what democracy looks like. So my plea to people is take some time to really start thinking about foundations of our democracy. So look at our website, fairdistrictspa.com. There's a lot about the problem and solution, but there's also a take action section. And I would say on whatever issue matters to you, take some action. Actually get to know who your state rep is, know who your state senator is, know where their office is, and call them and go by their office now and then. And please look at our website. There's a page, Contact Your Legislator, and figure out, does your legislator support redistricting reform? And if not, why not? And please go by their office and say, I'm just coming to ask, why does Representative so-and-so, why has this person not co-sponsored this bill? Where do they stand on this? Or the gift ban bill. You need to tell us the bill numbers. Ours are HB 22 and 23. But if they haven't co-sponsored them, why? Can they explain to you? Is it that they're waiting for the Democrats to gerrymander in 2021? That's not a good reason. And we need our folks to say, I'm sorry, that's not okay. We really want change before then, and we want you to support it. So unless people invest in talking to legislators, resolutions in their local communities, informing neighbors, actually speaking out on this stuff, unless, I love that Dr. Seuss line from the Lorax, and now I'm going to forget it.
Unless someone like you cares a whole lot, nothing's ever going to change. It's not.
Yep.
That's a great line and a great little cartoon to watch. I would argue that for a lot of people, they really don't understand the total legislative process. And there's a lot of emphasis and advocacy around getting out the vote. Let's get people to vote. Let's take control of the elections. And certainly that's one route we can take to reestablish democracy. But if people don't know the people that they're voting for, they don't understand how the process is rigged, they don't know what issues are at stake or how laws get passed, then it creates a real problem when you actually do make it, if you do make it, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, if you do make it to the election booth. And so my pitch is that it's back to school season, right? It's the first week. A lot of kids are going back to school. And I think, adults should be going back to school too, right? There's so much information on the internet right now. A lot of resources on sites like YouTube, and just a wealth of information about how all this works. And one of my favorite videos, since we're talking about children's cartoons, is the Schoolhouse Rock of how a bill gets passed, right? And so that's a great thing to watch. If you have children, watch it with them. I was at a meeting recently where an organizer was doing what you were doing, talking about the bills that they had on the table. And she mentioned, well, this one's in committee and there's a vote scheduled, and this one hasn't made it out of committee. This one was just introduced, but it'll probably die. And I think she took a moment and saw that the people in the room were a bit confused. And someone had the nerve to, she raised her hand and said, I don't know what this means. And she looked around the room. She goes, you guys know what this means? Like, what's the difference between a bill getting a vote and getting on the committee and dying? And the organizer said, okay, well, how many people here knows how a law is passed? And only a few hands went up. So we had to take a step back and explain, okay, So a legislator can introduce a bill, and a lot of them do, but they don't go anywhere. If they go to committee, if they go to the next step, go to committee, a lot of those bills don't ever get on the agenda. They don't get out of committee, or they're voted down in committee. If a bill gets out of committee, then it goes to a vote, but it only goes to, if it's a Senate bill, it goes to the Senate, right? And then it has to go to the House. So they kept asking, why is there a Senate bill and a House bill? Like, why are there two bills? And so we had to explain to people, and we realized, like, wow, we're trying to get people to call their legislators to advocate for these bills, but really, like, we need to do some basic education around the process for a bill. And so again, the point of all of this is that if you want to understand the process, that's probably the best place to begin. General civics. You were talking about all the things missing from schools. We don't have civics or government education anymore. And so libraries are also a really great wealth of information for people that don't have access to the internet, because there's still a lot of people that don't have access. And coming to events. So we took a moment at this event to explain to people the process. And people, no matter what your education level is, people can understand. If you understand how American Idol works, and people moving on to different rounds and voting and that kind of thing, America's Got Talent, that's another, summer favorite. So it's the same kind of process. So you will be able to understand this. So when we come back, I want to talk more about elections, right? Because obviously that's the next step. If we redraw the maps and then we have elections, we run into another set of roadblocks. And so Michael Pollack from March and Harrisburg is going to talk about what some of those things are and how they can be changed and improved. You're watching and listening to the People Power Lunch Hour on PhillyCAM TV and WPPM FM, and we'll be right back. Hello, welcome back to the People Power Lunch Hour show. I'm your host, Vanessa Maria Graber, and we're here at PhillyCAM talking about redistrict reform, gerrymandering, and elections. I have two guests in the studio. I have Rabbi and Executive Director of the March on Harrisburg, Michael Pollack, and I also have the co-founder and chair of Fair Districts PA, Carol Kuniholm. We've been talking about how the electoral maps in our state of Pennsylvania are gerrymandered and some of the progress that's been made with all of the organizing and people power that's been put towards this effort. And we've discussed the governor's commission on redistricting reform And now we are going to talk about elections. So if we draw the maps and we have an independent commission and our legislative districts are now more fair, more representative, and people are able to get to the polls and vote for people that are actually from and serving their districts, what are some of the roadblocks that we still have to address before we have a truly democratic state?
Right, so I want to back up to the idea of we just need to get out the vote. We just need to vote more. We just need more people to vote. Even if we were to fix redistricting, that would still not be enough because we vote for elected officials, and in order for us to even know who they are, they need to raise a certain amount of money to send out the mailers, to run ads, to hire a campaign staff, and that money needs to come from somebody, usually somebody who has money, and they use that money to control that politician and to affect whatever that politician said that they were going to do and to really change their agenda and shape it going forward. So even if we had, let's say, same-day registration, early voting, and automatic voter registration, and safe and secure voting machines, and we had redistricting reform, and you could show up and vote whenever you wanted for the person that you wanted to vote for, they would then go to Harrisburg. And their first day in Harrisburg, a lobbyist would walk into their office and say, so I see you're really interested in this issue. Let's go out to dinner tonight and talk it over. And you'd be out at dinner with them, and they'd buy you dinner, and you'd feel really nice and special. They'd wine and dine you and make you feel like a rock star. And you'd start to see that maybe their point of view has some logic to it, and you start to come around a little bit. And maybe you ran, in favor of public schools, but now you're sitting down with a nice charter school lobbyist, and they're making really good points. And then they say, okay, well, let's continue the conversation next week. I'll see you at the Eagles game. Let's hang out on the sideline together. Let's get the good tickets, and I got you covered. And you go, and they start telling you again about their points about why charter schools are better than public schools and why we need to deregulate. And you start to see this person as a friend. And you really, more than just somebody lobbying you for private interests, you start to build a relationship with them, and you start to hear their points of view, and you start coming around. And then they take you out to dinner another time, and they say, okay, so are you going to vote this way or that way on the bill? And you say, well, my constituents, I know they want me to vote this way, but you've made some really good points to vote for your side, but I'm going to vote with my constituents too. And then they might say, well, okay, so I think my donor, the people who back this lobbying firm, we're going to support your opponent in the primary election coming up, and we're going to fund them with $1 million. They're going to run attack ads against you. They're going to drag your name through the mud. And so are you sure you want to vote that way? Right? There's just so many ways that they enforce this obedience, this discipline to the lobbyists, to the donors, to the party leadership. So even if we have great elections, we still need to take on the money aspect. It needs to become illegal to bribe legislators. It needs to become illegal to promise legislators lucrative future jobs. You can't walk into a legislator's office wearing a $5,000 suit and say to them, hey, you want to work with me when you're done here? You can get a suit just like this. And they go, oh, yeah, you're right. I do have all this law school debt, and I have 3 kids going to college, and I need the money. So, yeah, I'll come work at your lobbying firm. Just tell me what to do for the next 4 years, and I'll do it, and then I'll switch over and play on your side for real. And there's just so many things that we need to do. And really, this all comes back to the idea that we need to build people power. Because we can send people to Harrisburg with the greatest of intentions. We can send them there with a 90% mandate to lead, but they get there and they get co-opted. They get there and they get bought. And so we need the people power to really balance out the corporate power, to balance out the power of the party interests, to stand up to that power and to counteract it. Because what we have right now, it's a cruel farce of a democracy. It's mean to tell people you just need to go vote in higher numbers. You just need to go register more voters. It's not nice. It's a joke. And so every 2 years we get told this lie again and again and again, and we do it, and we turn out, in record numbers, and we knock doors, and we do all of this, and then just nothing seems to happen. And that disconnect is frightening. So we need to follow our politicians to Harrisburg, organize the people power to keep them honest, and change the laws so that they can't be bribed. Just make bribery illegal. Just make corruption illegal. Make it so that they don't have to go and beg for millions of dollars from high-powered donors. Actually connect them with the people. It's really amazing. The concept is simple. Just make bribery illegal.
Yeah, I use a hashtag. I use 2 hashtags, and one is don't just vote. And people power, lunch hour is really a way to show people that if you really want to see change, right, you have to be the change. And that there's all these other ways besides just voting, right, to get involved and to affect what's happening. And the second one is, direct action gets the goods.
Oh, yeah.
Which is a favorite of mine, especially when people win victories. And so today when I saw that Carrie Lam, the leader of Hong Kong, withdrew the extradition bill, you and I were like, direct action gets the goods once again. And so there are all these different ways that people can participate. And I also want to talk about people who are disenfranchised voters, especially people who have been convicted felons or people who are undocumented, people here who are not U.S. citizens but maybe have permanent residence. There's a lot of people who can't vote. Young people under the age of 18 can't vote. And so the message that we should be sending to them, again, is, well, if you can't vote, these are all the things that you can do. So I want to give people two opportunities. So if you can, again, talk about these joint committee hearings and why it's important for people to show up, pay attention, and engage during this time. Can you talk about the two hearings that are coming up? And then afterwards, Michael, talk about some of the events that you have with March on Harrisburg.
So there's two hearings, one on the 16th of September, and I don't know the time, but the two state government committees are holding a joint hearing on election issues, which is almost unheard of. I don't know when those two committees have had a joint hearing on election issues. And they are meeting to talk through some of the reforms that Michael has talked about. They're also going to talk about open primaries, which is a big one to me. I'm a independent voter, which means I am locked out of our primaries, which means I have very little say often on what happens. And that's on September 16th in Harrisburg. On September 18th at 9 o'clock in the morning, the House State Government Committee is going to have a 2-hour hearing on redistricting reform. And I have to say, I'm really proud that we've encouraged lots of people to show up for hearings. We've packed the room for quite a few hearings. And folks who had never been in the building in Harrisburg show up, go to hearings, say, this is how it works. And then they go and they sit in session in the House and the Senate. Anybody can go and watch. It's really informative to go and see how that plays out. And there's also the possibility of a free half-hour tour in the Capitol building, which is really worth doing, just to say, this building should belong to us. It's our building. It's a really impressive building, but it's really upsetting to think about the kinds of things that happen there and who feels like they own the building. And we're trying to say, you don't own the building, we own the building. So going to hearings is important. Also, there's lots of public meetings. I would say Fair Districts PA has tons of public meetings. You can find them on our website. You also were talking about learning more about how bills are passed or understanding advocacy. We've got a YouTube channel that has a section on advocacy which explains the process for bills and how you can be an advocate for issues that you care about. So there's lots of interesting stuff on there. Lots of opportunities coming up to learn and to engage.
I would also add, if you can't make it to Harrisburg, for some people, like, oh gosh, I work, I can't take that off. You can also call the staffers and ask for an update. And I think that's something that I've done a couple times when I can't make it to a hearing, but I want to know what's going on. I'll call and say, hey, I know this was an important hearing today. Can you give me an update? I'm a constituent. I care about this issue. Can you give me any information on comments that my representative made, or what is the outcome? What are the next steps? How can I continue following? And they're usually like, oh, okay, yeah, let me tell you about that. They're not expecting that, but certainly they're knowledgeable enough to tell you they're following it. And if tons of people call wanting some kind of accountability update on what's going on, that also sends an important message.
The principle is force the encounter at every opportunity, however that looks, however possible. Whether that's marching to Harrisburg, marching into the Capitol, and throwing $500 in cash from the House gallery to make the legislators see that money cannot be speech and that they need to make bribery illegal. Or it's making phone calls, or it's writing postcards, or it's anything. It's bothering the staffers. It's showing up to the district office. It's coming to hearings in Harrisburg. Just force the encounter. Get in their face so much, because they do not like like that. And when you do that, they see you and they have to respond to you. The natural human response to a face that's suffering is service, right? When you see the face of the other, you are ordered and ordained to serve. And that's the reaction we're going for when we get in their face. When Speaker Turzai sees us enough times and he just can't get away from us and he can't look away, eventually either he says, oh, I guess I have to do the right thing, or everybody around him says, hey, Mike, just do the right thing. And he finally goes, oh, fine, I see my own people are turning against me. Whatever, I'll just do the right thing and get this over
Well,
with.
a couple of years ago when we talked about Turzai, he was not anywhere near endorsing a gift ban. And so I guess he changed his mind.
We forced the encounter. We made it so that he did not want to deal with us anymore. Yeah, it's been a fun ride with him. Been a fun journey.
So you have a couple of things. And again, I just want to make a quick point about long-term organizing.
Yeah.
This doesn't happen overnight. You have to be committed for the long haul. But also, like, people can contribute as much as they can, and in many different ways. But this is something that, we're looking to the future. And if you have children, it's like parents are always thinking about, oh, when they go off to college. It's like, it's sort of the same thing. You have to be future focused when it comes to this work. So you have an event this weekend at the Poor People's Hearing.
Yep. New Covenant Church in Germantown in Philly. We have a Poor People's campaign, Poor People's Hearing. So come on out. We're going to be listening. Part of the PPC, part of the whole idea is that you shift the narrative by shifting the narrator. So a Poor People's Hearing is people coming out and telling their authentic first-person stories about dealing with the issues that the Poor People's Campaign is working on. The interlocking evils of systemic racism, ecological devastation, the war economy and militarism, and poverty, and shifting the distorted moral narrative of our times. So come on out and join us. This is a great fusion movement. We're all getting out of our silos. We're all joining together. We're doing the deep dive organizing, the base building across the state, and we're building up that movement power so that politicians have to respond to people, not to corporate interests. And then September 16th, after the hearing, we'll be doing a canvassing training in South Philly, and then we'll be canvassing across South Philly all through September and October. Then this spring, we're going to be marching from York to Harrisburg. We haven't set the exact date yet. We have to wait for the legislature to set their dates so that we get there when they're there, because we always like to have fun when they're there and force the encounter. But we'll be going 45 miles from York to Harrisburg, and then on June 20th, 2020, we'll be descending on Washington, D.C. It's the Poor People's Campaign Moral Gathering. This is going to be March on Washington Part 2. We've been tasked with getting 30,000 Pennsylvanians down to D.C. I know other states have similar goals, so this is going to be big. This is going to be really big. June 20th, 2020, be there. It's going to be a lot of fun.
Right, and PhillyCAM is also going to be offering a number of community engagement events and trainings about the census coming up this month in September. So you can go to our website, PhillyCAM.org. Everybody is invited. It's really important to be counted and to understand what's at stake during the census, and to make sure that your community is represented. It affects all these things. And no matter what your issue is, like you said, whether you're concerned about the climate crisis or gun violence or the drug war or healthcare, there's so many issues. Having redistrict reform, electoral reform, an end to corruption, they're all important factors in making the change that we so desire. Thank you so much for all the work that you do and for being on the show today.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
All right, you can find more information by going to PhillyCAM.org. This episode and all of our episodes are online on demand. You can also go to our YouTube channel at PhillyCAM to find former episodes of the People Power Lunch Hour show. And we're going to continue our coverage on elections and democracy in the next 2 months. Thank you so much for listening and watching. We'll be back next week.
Your voice. People Power Media, broadcasting right here in Center City. WPPM-LP Philadelphia. Find out more at Philly.